now you have combination biologic therapy, much like they do combination therapies in cancer or in HIV drug for AIDS. We think that combination modalities are the future of ALS, and it's the only way that you can get the disease under control.
Welcome to another episode of Forging the Future. And the conversation today is going to be exciting as we're talking about a company and a therapy that's going to change the world. I'd like to welcome Howard Berman, CEO and Chairman, and Daniel Barvin, VP of Operations and Patient Advocacy at Coya Therapeutics. So welcome, Howard and Daniel. So before we dive into this groundbreaking work that you're doing at Coya, maybe Howard, maybe you could tell me a little bit about your role now and what led you to Coya Therapeutics.
Well, thank you. Well, appreciate you for having us today.
Sure.
Yeah. So this was a very serendipitous meeting that I had with a very world-renowned doctor in Houston named Dr. Stanley Appel. I was taking my father in for an appointment at Houston Methodist, and I was working in the pharmaceutical industry. I had a PhD, and I'd known how to develop drugs. And my father, unfortunately, had cognitive loss. He had a progressive dementia, very, very difficult. So I found the best physician probably in the country, Dr. Appel. And, unfortunately, Dr. Appel told me that, this is progressive and it's unlikely that there's going to be any major improvements. But he said, look, I have something else that is very interesting and I'm working on clinically and in the lab. Why don't you meet me next week? And he asked me this because he knew of my background in the knowledge of how to develop and launch and commercialize drugs. So I met him the following week and he showed me some clinical data, which was remarkable. It was unbelievable what he had done. He had done it in ALS, but he was working in Alzheimer's disease and dementias as well. And together he said, Howard, look, you know how to raise money. You know how to commercialize drugs. Do you want to do this with me? And I went back to my wife. It didn't take very long. I came back to him the next day and I said, absolutely. So we launched Coya and we've raised quite a bit of money and we've gone through the whole cycle. We've raised money, we've stayed private, and then we went public on NASDAQ. One of the few IPOs last year in biotech.
Especially for a Houston company, right?
It's unheard of for a Houston company. You're either usually a company in Boston or San Diego or San Francisco, because Houston's not the epicenter of that sort of thing. But I think there's a lot to learn and to teach and to mentor people here in Houston on how to do something similar and leverage the research that's going on here.
And it was a very short timeline, right? I mean, a lot of times with these bio companies, it takes a while, right?
The benefit of what we did was I identified technology in therapeutics that was far along and had taken in a lot of non-dilutive funding, taken it through the clinic already. So whereas most companies start preclinically and you've got to march down and it costs a lot of money, we had taken technologies that had already generated the clinical data. So yes, it was quick, but it was so exciting we were able to push forward and raise capital.
And how long did it really take? I mean, what was that journey from when you first had that conversation with the doctor to actually IPO?
Yeah. Well, I will say we started in 2020 and the IPO was at the end of 2022. So wow. It was just under 3 years.
Okay. That is exciting.
It's fast.
Congratulations.
Thank you.
And Daniel, likewise, I mean, maybe you could tell me a little bit about your role and what led you to Coya.
Of course. So like Howard, my story is also personal. And, being a part of Coya is truly one of the most meaningful things that I have done in my early career. Unfortunately, I lost my aunt, uncle, and father to ALS and frontotemporal dementia.
Sorry to hear that.
It was very traumatic. And as I was starting my MBA at Rice University, I actually lost my father after a 15-year battle with frontotemporal dementia. So had that in my mind as I entered the program. And in the middle of the program, I got married and also learned that the connection between all of those diseases was hereditary and that I would be the next generation at risk. And shortly after the MBA, after taking a job in finance, I realized that I carried that gene and my future would not be guaranteed the way I thought it might. And so my direction turned towards how can I make a difference in that community for genetic ALS and FTD, and formed a nonprofit called End the Legacy that's focusing on education, awareness, etc., for that community. And along the way, started saying, how can I now take the skills that I've learned, the relationships I've made, and make a difference in the therapeutic arena? And luckily, Howard and I had a very serendipitous meeting, and I was on the Coya team in the blink of an eye, and it's been the most incredible 3 years, really, of my entire career. So thrilled to be here.
Nice. Yeah, we're very big on collisions here and how those relationships happen and how people come together. So thanks for telling that story. I think most people know what ALS is, but not what FTD is. What is that?
Sure. So FTD is frontotemporal dementia. And the variant that my father had is called BVFTD, behavioral variant FTD. So this is dementia that acts on the behavioral function of a patient, kind of tearing down the societal norms that we all have built up through our lives, that we all understand and live by. And unfortunately, allowing that person to live outside of those norms. And it's incredibly difficult on the family. And the progression is somewhat quick in certain cases, but the disease course can be quite long. My father lived for 15 years with this disease. And it's one of the diseases that we have focused on and hopefully will be able to address in the future. So I'm being able to be connected to both to Coya, where we are looking to treat ALS as our first indication, and maybe eventually down the line FTD. It's passion and mission. I mean, completely combined.
One of the commonalities between FTD and ALS is driven by a mutation that Daniel has called C9orf72. So no one understands why that mutation. Some patients develop ALS, which is a disease of the motor neuron, and FTD, which is a disease of the brain and the frontal lobe and the temporal lobe. No one understands why there's differentiating aspects in terms of the phenotype or how the disease comes about, but these diseases are related. And some patients with ALS get FTD as well. So there's commonalities.
If I may, that's really the beauty of what Coya is doing and the scientific discovery that Howard latched onto with Dr. Appel. The idea that all neurodegenerative disease is driven by overblown inflammation, and that all of these diseases drive an inflammatory response that eventually damages regulatory T cells. And what Coya is trying to do is develop therapies that can eventually have an effect on the broad-ranging diseases in the neurodegenerative space.
They're both such devastating diseases. I mean, that's, I think, anyone's worst nightmare, right? To essentially lose the function of your body or lose your mind, right? Why Coya? Why did you name it Coya? I'm always interested in why people pick their company names.
Well, it has to have some meaning behind it, right? Every company does. So we originally started as Nicoya, and it was ultimately changed to Coya, which is shortened from Nicoya. Nicoya is an island off of Costa Rica. It's a place where people have longevity. They live a long time into their 90s. So it just felt right. This is what we're trying to do. Live long, live healthy.
Live long and prosper. Sorry, Star Trek reference, but
Absolutely.
I love it.
Absolutely.
So maybe describe a little bit more about the therapy and the science behind it. It sounds magical. I mean, like Asimov said, right? The difference between science and magic.
Well, it's magical because the early data, we've been able to stop the progression of the disease, the early clinical data we have, which is remarkable because these patients are on an incessant decline month after month. The treatment is based on this knowledge that inflammation, everyone here has heard about inflammation. It's not the inflammation you think about in a bacterial infection or an acute inflammation, but more of a chronic inflammation that is generated because the neurons, where in the motor neurons in this case, they get into trouble, they become sick. So your immune cells send the immune system sends their cells to the sick neurons to try and repair them. It's effective initially, but then ultimately becomes ineffective, and ultimately it becomes a pathologic process. So the inflammation helps kill these neurons. So our goal is to stop the inflammatory process and slow it. And our drugs work to ramp up what is called the regulatory T cell, the Treg, which is the most important cell that controls inflammation. And they're all screwed up in ALS. So that's what we do with one of our drugs called low-dose IL-2, but we add another drug to combine it with called CTLA-4, and that's a protein that blocks other aspects of the immune system called macrophages that are bad because they cause Tregs to become dysfunctional. So when you put the two together, they're synergistic. So now you have combination biologic therapy, much like they do combination therapies in cancer or in HIV drug for AIDS. We think that combination modalities are the future of ALS, and it's the only way that you can get the disease under control.
So how are these diseases currently being treated, and what gap exists?
Yeah. So unfortunately, there's not a lot of treatments that are approved. There's only 3 drugs. There's a drug called Radicava, which is almost a free radical scavenger in the blood. There's a drug called Riluzole, which is an old drug. And then there's a recent one called Relivrio, which is a combination of 2 drugs that works on the mitochondria. Unfortunately, none of these will stop the progression. The patients are still progressing pretty quickly. So the gap here is that we need new treatments, novel treatments that really can do better than that and are not incremental, but exponential. And we think and we believe that inflammation is driving the disease, not just ALS, but other neurodegenerative conditions. So our hope and our goal to cover that gap is to have patients live a long time, like HIV and AIDS. They still may have the disease, but it's going to be under control, and they will continue to live in normal or somewhat normal lives, but we can extend their lives for many, many years.
It sounds a little bit like Lorenzo's Oil, right? Did you see that movie?
Yes.
Yeah. So was it like you can take this medication and basically the problem that was solving, which was an engineer, by the way, solved that too, right? Where figured out, let's have these. I'm not medical, so I'm butchering this. Whatever the proteins or things or bad things were bonding to this oil that they were taking instead of the body, which is causing, I think, also a neurological degeneration, right?
Absolutely. But I will tell you, this is not just a sudden realization. Or a hypothesis that just came up. Dr. Stanley Appel, whose idea, this was based off all of his idea. He is the preeminent ALS expert in the world. Probably he is the thought leader that the thought leaders go to. He is the most eminent person in the field. So he's been working on this, and he's been screaming on top of the banisters that this is one of the fundamental underlying reasons that the patients are declining. So a lot of this work has been based off lots of money being put in from philanthropy and non-dilutive mechanisms. And so it's been a buildup over many years, but now we're finally realizing it.
It's always fascinating to me that so often it takes really one person with a voice like that, trying to, like you said, scream from the rooftops. When you look at the history of insulin and things like that, right? And that you had all these kids that, once they gave them the insulin shot, they actually woke up, right? And all of a sudden became normal kids again, which they thought were never going to happen, right? And this did not exist before. So that's very exciting that you've seen that kind of progress.
To add to what Howard said, we are looking at how patients will perceive these therapies and the needs that they have. And as someone who is at risk of developing ALS or FTD, my key focus is on how we can be as adaptive and caring as possible. Unfortunately, we really cannot accelerate the delivery of these therapies to patients because we do have to go down a regulatory pathway where we ensure safety, efficacy, all of the above. But I think that what we can show is that we have people who are incredibly committed. Howard and I both have personal stories. We are personally vested in bringing these therapies to patients, and we are pursuing our next trial as fast as possible to get patients in, to stop the progression of their disease, and to hopefully change the future of what these patients experience when they're diagnosed with ALS.
Is the word starting to get out a little bit? Are people starting to ask about it?
100%. So I field our emails that come into our website, and it's constantly patients saying, how can I have access? Especially after we released our proof of concept data of Coya 302 and ALS. Never before had patients seen a therapy where progression was nearly stopped. Most studies in ALS are done over 6 months. We performed a study of 4 patients over 48 weeks. And we stopped progression to -1.5 points on the ALS FRS score. That is in comparison to some drugs that are approved, where at 6 months, they only stop progression to -7 points. So you can see why the excitement, why the fervor is there. And we want to be able to do everything we can to bring that solution to them.
Well, it sounds like you're moving fast. There's definitely a need. Maybe, Howard, what type of traction have you already experienced in the development and progress?
Yeah, I'll talk to 2 different studies, one in ALS and one in Alzheimer's disease. So in ALS, as Daniel had previously mentioned, we ran a small study, but this was a proof of concept trial in 4 patients, but we ran it over a period of 48 weeks. We stopped the progression, and these were in patients that were declining on an incessant manner prior to treatment. And at 6 months, the patients had stopped progression. At 12 months, there was hardly any decline whatsoever. So that's a very exciting result. And then we also measured in their blood, and everything that we had hoped for. Their Tregs were up, their inflammation was down. So very exciting. And in Alzheimer's disease, we've tested using one of the components of our drugs called Coya 301. We've tested 8 patients with Alzheimer's disease, mild to moderate Alzheimer's disease, and a scale called the MMSE. It's one of the scales they measure cognitive function. The patients actually statistically significantly improved their cognition. So they didn't stop, they didn't decline, they actually improved, which is something you don't see. And it means that when you enhance Tregs and you modify Tregs, you're doing something very remarkable and very important in the disease pathophysiology. And our goal is we think that Alzheimer's, which we targeted with one of the drugs, we think by putting the 2 drugs together for Alzheimer's like we did for ALS, may even be better than that result by itself. So there's a lot of traction. It's a lot of excitement. Now we just have to execute on our clinical trials.
How excited is your doctor partner about finally getting this out and seeing some progress?
He's beside himself because he couldn't have done this himself. He's an academic. He's been raising money through grant funding, but not the sort of money that you need to commercialize. So he's very happy, and we've stayed very close from the beginning, and we remain very tight, and I think he's quite proud of our progress.
I would imagine. Well, I mean, IPO'ing and getting FDA approvals is no easy task, right? I don't even know how to approach that kind of problem. So maybe tell me a little bit about the experience of getting to and past these 2 milestones.
Yeah. Well, it's almost as difficult as running a software company.
Yeah, okay.
But I think those are a very important milestones. Nothing worthwhile is easy, as you know. And if it were easy, then everyone would do it. So for us, let me just say, to go through the whole private to public transition, I'd never done it before. And I can tell you it's something that you should always, if you've never done it, you should go and do it, because you can put that a feather in your cap. And it's truly meaningful. And now our stock is trading, and we're trading, as of today, when we're doing this interview, we're trading above our IPO price, which is really good in
this day and age.
In this day and age, we're above our IPO price. Our story is becoming much more socialized out there. People are recognizing who we are and what we're doing. And I can tell you it's very promising. And all our clinical data is pointing to much more interest from investors and patient advocacy groups that are reaching out to us.
Now, you've never done it before. So what was your approach? Hey, we want to go IPO. We want to get this. We see that we had the chance to do this. There's money behind that. You made the decision.
Yeah.
Then what? How did you actually solve that problem?
Yeah, well, the investors the Series A investors, those who put the money in earliest and who put more money in as the company was private. They were all supportive of putting even more money into the company, but they wanted to do it into a public vehicle. And so there was a marketable security behind it. There's benefits to being a public company as being a private company, right? And so we had the support of existing investors as well as other institutional investors that wanted to come in on the deal. And everything aligned, and we had our audit done. Everything aligned for us to go public, even in a difficult climate last year.
Was it NASDAQ or New York Stock Exchange?
NASDAQ.
NASDAQ, okay. Yeah. And did you get to ring the bell? Or
Not yet, but they actually have promised that.
Okay.
And
Beautiful.
I think they're backed up and they're delayed in terms of that. But yeah, it will happen.
Okay.
I'll add to the IPO experience. We are an incredibly small team. When Howard started the company, it was himself and a co-founder. I came on as first employee, and that made 3. We had a gang of consultants who helped us actually run the company and be successful. But when we did the IPO, we only had 5 employees.
Wow.
And it took a Herculean effort to move that through each stage of progress. And then when it came to actually raising the funds to go public, that took personal connections, that took hundreds of calls to each of our networks, personal investment. We really stretched as far as we could to make this happen. And, now on the other side, we're just so thrilled that we have the opportunity to continue down this journey that we know has promise at the end.
I wouldn't have guessed that you could go public with a 5-person company.
Well,
actually,
I'll give you an analogy. My brother, who went public on his company, which is a much larger company, they had hundreds of employees, and they deployed a lot of those people to do just the S1 to go public.
Wow.
And
Was that about this thick or something?
it's thick, and ours was that thick too. Can you imagine? We on a skeleton crew, we were able to do that, and I think it's the testament. The testament is of everyone involved, including Daniel and everyone. We all put money into the IPO, which is also pretty rare to do. A lot of founders don't put their own money into a deal. We did because we believe in it. So.
What about the FDA part of that? I think the COVID vaccines don't even have FDA approval yet, right? Is that like a...
Correct you quickly. We do not have FDA approval.
I know you don't have it yet, but I think you're working on it.
Yes,
right?
we are. We are working towards that.
Yeah.
Maybe Howard can share a bit of the progress and hopes we have for the regulatory pathway.
Yeah.
So, that's the critical perspective, is to work with the agency together as partners to make sure that you cover safety and tolerability and efficacy or effectiveness of the therapy. So we go through a series of clinical trials. You have interactions with the FDA. You talk back and forth about what may be required, what they want to see in a clinical trial, what they want to see in terms of manufacturing. You come to an agreement, and then you run the trial, and that's when your data will speak for itself. If it's positive, you hope that that's going to be sufficient for an approval. So we're constantly talking to the FDA. And
how long do you think that process will actually take, say, optimistically?
Yeah. So we anticipate for ALS doing a trial starting at filing an application to the FDA called an IND at the end of this year. And that trial would probably be a randomized, double-blind, well-powered trial that will, if it gives us significance, that could be meaningful enough. Of course, we'll have to work that with the FDA. That trial will be about 16 to 18 months long. And hopefully that data would be sufficient to petition the FDA for a registration approval.
We have seen with the recent approvals of 2 ALS therapies, one in the genetic space for SOD1 and one for sporadic ALS, the patient advocacy community is incredibly strong and vocal. And we have seen the FDA be helpful to allow these companies who show efficacy to move forward their therapies through to patients. And so we are hopeful that is the same pathway that we'll go down.
So I know how to manufacture hardware and how to build software, but how do you actually manufacture a biologic?
Yeah. Well, you it's not easy, but it's much easier than where we've been. We started off with cell therapy, which is much more complex, where you take the patient's cells from their body, you manipulate them outside the body, and you give it back. That's complex. It's expensive. It's cumbersome. We've done that, and we learned how Tregs work, and it was very promising. We've evolved that into what are called biologics, and these are simple proteins that you can manufacture, and I'll go into that in a second, but then that are simply injected into your arm like a subcutaneous injection, like an insulin injection, and then do its thing. The products are manufactured under GMP, which is the characterization of the quality that is required by FDA, and it's a streamlined, known process that the products are go through in order to meet the requirements of FDA. But the costs are relatively inexpensive compared to things like cell therapy, well-characterized proteins. And, fortunately, we've been able to sign agreements with large companies, one of them being Dr. Reddy's Laboratories, $1 billion manufacturer from India, where we're getting one of our drugs. So we're very fortunate to have these sort of partners that make quality products that have gone through all the controls and experiments.
I guess that makes sense. Just like hiring a contract manufacturer in China or wherever to get your hardware built and developed, right? So well, thanks for clarifying that.
Sure.
Well, what would you tell med tech and bio companies who are considering founding their companies in Houston about the current ecosystem here, and maybe a little bit about your experience in the medical center?
Yeah. Well, doing it in Houston is not as easy as doing it on the East or the West Coast because there's more money in those areas. However, Houston is the largest medical center in the world and some of the greatest technology and innovations. So first you have to find the technology here, and you could be a scientist or an inventor at Houston Methodist or at MD Anderson, and developing something novel and innovative. You would have to go through the tech transfer process, patent your technology. And then, of course, if you want to start a company, you have to identify investors. And that's where it comes to being able to sell the science. Hopefully you have some data that is compelling. Make the agreements and relationships work with your early stage investors. And then, of course, incubate your company. And there's a lot of work that's involved there. But I am we're proof that you can do it, and you can start from scratch, and you can take it all the way through to an IPO. And so if there's any way that I can share my experience, or we could share our experience collectively, we'd be happy to help the ecosystem here, because it's Houston, and that's where we grew up. And so any way that people can leverage our successes, it would be great.
Which medical center did you partner with specifically?
It was Houston Methodist, the
Houston
hospital
Methodist.
system.
Okay,
Yeah.
that's great.
Yeah.
Sounds like they've been a great partner for you.
They've been great.
Well, thanks. That's very exciting. Wish you all the luck in getting that technology developed. Looks very well needed. I've got my biology socks on today, as you notice, in honor of your solution and your startup. And I have a gift here for both of you. And you mentioned needing some cool socks.
I love it.
You can maybe decide.
Thank
which ones
you.
want. Here's one I call the shots. I don't know.
That might be Howard.
That would be me. I always needed new
Thank
socks.
you.
Thank you.
No problem. Well, thanks for being on the show.
Thank you, Charlie.
Thank you.
This was
Pleasure.
absolutely incredible.
Thank you.